I don't use the word game changer lightly, but the arrival of rain on iRacing has brought a whole new dimension to the simulator we know and love. However, for a lot of people, rain just means confusion and frustration, as everything they thought they knew is washed away. Wet weather driving is counterintuitive, so by looking to learn about it, you'll have the advantage. I'm here to try and demystify wet weather racing and get those who hate it to love it. This video is supported by Acertech Sim Sports. Get 5% off with the code DannyLee on their official shops, links in description. When a track is dry, pretty much all of the track is nice and grippy, both on and off the standard racing line. The question of which parts of the track have grip and which parts don't isn't something you have to worry about all that much. But when it's wet, that changes completely, and the normal racing line you typically take becomes quite slippy, as it's been polished, smoothed and rubbered in from the thousands of cars travelling over it. Being fast in the rain is all about using a different line that puts your tyres on the parts of the track that are the most unpolished, rough and abrasive. It's the rougher surfaces off the racing line that will give your tyres the best grip underneath them. So much so that it's actually faster to use a weird, eccentric line through corners when there's water on the ground. Here's a typical example of the dry line. You'll recognise this as your standard, everyday racing line. Now imagine there have been cars driving this line many thousands of times, filling it in with rubber. If you were to walk out on the track and look at it closely, even touch it, you would find that the track surface is clearly smoother here than it is off of the racing line. Smooth surfaces are great when dry, but slippery when wet. Now here's a typical example of the wet line. The point of turning is later, and you typically skirt out wide before sharpening in the second half of the corner to create a straighter line on exit. The late turn-in means you're putting yourself onto the rough surface on the outskirts of a racing line, giving you better grip when you turn the wheel. Then, during the corner, by turning more sharply and straightening your exit, you avoid spending time on the slippy line as much as possible whilst putting power down to the ground on exit. Crossing over the slippy line is something you have to do to complete the corner, but ideally you want to be doing it in a straight line and for as little time as possible, especially in higher powered cars. Otherwise the car might break loose as you cross over it and cost you time. In the dry, taking the wet line will be slower all day long and by a lot, but in the wet it's faster because of a vast difference in grip between the dry line and the wet line more than makes up for the unusual line you're taking. The wet line is all about one thing, finding grip and traction on the rough surfaces. Speaking of which, water makes curbs and painted surfaces really very slippery, so you also should avoid placing your tyres on anything that isn't grey asphalt. Accidentally slipping a tyre on a painted surface will absolutely kill your run with zero forgiveness, and whilst you might be aware of curbs being dangerous, watch out for any painted white lines on the very edges of a track and pit exit lines that cross over into the braking zones. My love for wet weather is due to two things. One, I'm British and it just rains so bloomin' much. Secondly, I've done my fair share of outdoor rental karting in the rain. By rental karting I mean the karts have slick tyres, and if it rains, you learn in a fun way how much better the wet line is. If you want to understand for yourself just how much better the grip is off a racing line and out on the rough bits, go rental karting in the rain. You'll absolutely be blown away and have a newfound respect for F1 drivers in wet weather. And iRacing's implementation of rain feels shockingly reminiscent of those greasy kart tracks. So as far as I'm concerned, they've successfully bottled up that same feeling. So here's an example of a lap of Barcelona where I tried to drive the wet line, and I'll point out how each corner is taken with rain in mind. Although I am also in the early stages of adapting to the weather, the wet line was over a second quicker than the dry line in this session for me, and felt much more controlled, safe and consistent. I'll walk you through. At turn 1 and 2, I wait maybe another 5 meters before I usually turn into the corner, so I can find the grip just off the racing line, and I'm going slower than normal so that I can turn harder whilst the grip is there, before I cross the slippery dry line between 1 and 2. Same for turn 2, but I can't do it quite as pronounced, so I have to spend some time on the slippy line ready to set up for turn 3. For the long turn 3, I stay wide as that's where the dry line isn't. This is where I find the most grip and can maintain the most speed. The horrible thing about the wet line in corners like this is that you have to have faith that the grip is there, because the line takes you much closer to the edges of a track where you don't normally want to be, but that's where the grip is. I cross back over the dry line later in the turn. That's when the car steps out a little bit and I have to control it just for a moment until I'm safely over it. There's no avoiding that crossover moment, so it just has to be anticipated and managed. Turn 4, same again. I turn in later and stay wide, though I do jump the gun a bit on crossing back over the dry line and end up in that slippy line for a second or two, which causes the car to slide quite a bit until I'm out of it again. Turn 5, a short hairpin. I delay turn in so that I can find grip out wide, then cross back over the dry line and put my foot down. You'll want to avoid the dry line on the exit of slow turns, not least because of slippery curbs, but because the grip benefit of being off a racing line can also help you power out of lower gears just the same. Turn 7 and 8, much like turn 1 and 2, take caution under braking as you're braking on the slippery dry line, but then delay turning and try and get as much angle change done as possible for the short moment you're in the rough bit, so that you're able to drive as straight as possible once you have to rejoin the dry line. Turn 9 is a great example of a typical wet line. Delay turning, stay wide of a racing line, then pick your moment to sharpen the turn and cross the slippery dry line for as little time as possible, so you can accelerate as straight as possible on the grippier part of the track. Turn 10 wasn't all that well done. I found myself mistakenly following the dry line for the first half, but for the exit I wanted to get myself off the racing line before I put the power down. Traction is a lot better on a wet line coming out of this corner and makes a big difference to the sector time. Turn 12, much like turn 4, stay out wide on the rough bit to maintain grip and corner speed, then pick a moment to sharpen the turn and then cut back. I spend quite a long time rejoining the dry line on exit, hence the car stepping out and being harder to control. 13, 14 and 15 were just following the dry line because there's not much room for artistic expression there. But for turn 16 it is made considerably faster by staying wide of a racing line, much more grip, much better average speed, and will set up very nicely for the start-finish straight. So the moral of the story is this: when it's raining, the rougher, grainier, less polished parts of a track surface are your friend, and oftentimes you have to go to the edges of the track off a racing line to find them. Racing in the rain is an evolving puzzle that I'm simplifying a lot in this video, because the difference in grip between the wet and dry line can be vastly different depending on the state of a track and how much rubber has been put down and the surface properties. Not to mention how much it's raining, any puddles of standing water on the track that you might have to avoid, or the presence of a dried out racing line that's been cut out by the cars on track. These can all fluidly change where the fastest line truly is, and it's for this reason that rain is a whole new skill set to learn. These are more advanced facets of rain that I'm sure I'll get to covering, but for now, just knowing the basic approach will do you a lot of good. I hope this gives you a little bit of a primer on wet weather racing. It's a real challenge, but hopefully now you have a sense of how to approach it and learn to love it. Cheers again.